Ships and Shipping in Cyprus during World War II by Tim Reardon, freelance historian. Tim Reardon is a freelance historian specialising in Cyprus during the Second World War. He is currently writing a narrative history of the conflict, tracing military developments on the island and setting them in the context of the course of the war in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. He has previously lectured on the wartime development of Nicosia airfield, from its origins as an empty landing ground in the 1930s to the foremost military installation on the island by 1945. On the decisive role played by forces in Cyprus in enforcing the blockade of Syria in 1941, and how the island featured in the effort to deceive the German and Italian high commands about Allied strategy in southern Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Reardon on ships and shipping in Cyprus during World War II.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Any account of travel to Cyprus in the 1930s will mention the Khedivial mail line, the weekly service subsidised by the government to provide a regular connection between Cyprus and Egypt. And note in particular, it serves Cyprus ports, not just Famagusta. It also served Limassol, Larnaca, and on every second week, Paphos, every fourth week in the winter time. Famagusta was the only port with a deep water quay on the island, but at each of the other ports there was a fleet of lighters that shuttled the passengers and cargo between ship and shore. The Khedivial ships carried the mails, most of the passengers that came to the island, and most of the island's imports as well, chiefly flour, rice, cotton, vegetable oils and fuel. And they carried out some of its exports, including carrots, grain, citrus, tobacco and wine. Italian, French and Greek liners also called at the island, and separately tramp ships called at Karavastasi to load copper ore and at Ziggy to load asbestos, the island's largest and most profitable exports. And there was also, of course, a large fleet of sailing vessels carrying goods to and from Palestine, Egypt, Turkey and Greece, and coastwise around Cyprus itself, although their number was declining already by the end of the 1930s. The Second World War changed all of that. Trading with enemy countries was prohibited altogether. Trading outside the sterling area was restricted by licence in order to preserve the value of the currency. And above all, merchant ships throughout the Mediterranean and elsewhere were requisitioned. Many of the ships themselves remained where they were. This, for instance, is the steamship Fouadier, the Khedivial mail line's ship that had before the war provided the weekly service between Cyprus and Egypt. But they were taken over by the army and were no longer available for commercial traffic. This photograph was taken in Famagusta in December 1939 and shows Cypriot recruits for the army embarking for service in Egypt. And one interesting thing to note about this photograph, it was released for publication in the press. And you'll note, the ship's name is nowhere visible. It was here on the side of the ship, the camera photo starts there. And nor is there anywhere in this photograph any information about defences in the harbour. They're all out of shot. There is nothing here that would be useful to the enemy. The demands of the army were huge for shipping, and they grew steadily throughout 1940. This is a plot of the Royal Navy's operations on a single day, the 27th of November 1940, when the British reinforcement of Greece was in full swing. The main supply convoys there from Egypt to Greece, convoys through to the centre of the Mediterranean, and a very small convoy in the very east of the Mediterranean between Famagusta and Palestine. And remember that the Navy was playing a supporting role only. The bulk of the convoy was merchant ships. It was merchant ships that carried the troops, it was merchant ships that carried the tanks, it was merchant ships that carried the food and the supplies. It was a massive logistical operation set up during the war, a whole new ministry was set up to do it, the Ministry of War Transport, predecessor to today's Ministry and Department of Transport, controlled locally by the principal sea transport office at Egypt, based in Alexandria. And the numbers involved were vast. From mid-1941 to mid-1943, when the garrison of Cyprus was at its height, it numbered some 20,000 men. And every 4 months or so, most of the units on the island would be taken out and replaced. An enormous logistical operation typically lasting about a week. Some 12,000 men in an average relief would be embarked at Famagusta, and a similar number embarked at Beirut, and they would shuttle to and fro in a sequence of convoys. And as well as the soldiers, there was all their equipment. This photograph shows mobile anti-tank guns arriving at Famagusta in the summer of 1941. And again, taken for publication in the press, there is nothing here that identifies either the ship or the place. And think for a minute of all the equipment needed to fight a war. Weapons, ammunitions, tanks, trucks, machineries for building airfields, aircraft spare parts, petrol and food. And bear in mind that this is just Cyprus. The Ministry of War Transport allocated a small amount of space on its ships for priority export cargoes from Cyprus, commodities that were deemed vital to the war effort, but it wasn't very much. At the end of 1940, the Cyprus government was so concerned that the island would have no way of getting its important cargoes in and out, that it actually chartered its own ship. A small steamer, roughly a third of the size of the Khedivial ship that had been operating on the route before the war, and they renamed it the SS Cyprus, to enable at least some of the island's export crops to be taken out and to help in importing some of the imported essentials. And great reliance was also put on the fleet of sailing ships, the famous Kegs. You can see some of them here in this German photograph of Limassol taken in April 1943. The small sailing boats were used for two main streams of traffic. They were used for exports of carrots, potatoes and other crops, for which they were well suited because small vessels they could collect at various ports around the island close to where the things themselves were produced. And they were also used for imports of petrol, again for many of the same reasons. The small size of the vessels meant that they could distribute them around the coast of the island, and also it meant that if the Germans or Italians sank one of them, the loss overall would be modest. You can also see, right down there, some of the smaller dots, the lighters that served the main ports. When Italy entered the war in the early summer of 1940, all the lighters in Cyprus ports were beached, towed up onto the beach to keep them out of the way of the enemy use. But by the August, they'd all been refloated, and they remained in use throughout the war. But as this photo also shows, what the Germans were really interested in was larger merchant vessels. They're a freighter of approximately 1,000 tons, possibly the Cyprus. Most of the Luftwaffe's aerial reconnaissance flights over Cyprus included one or other of the main ports of the island, because shipping was so important to the war effort. This photograph of Famagusta, taken in August of 1943, shows two reasonably sized merchant vessels there and there tied up alongside the quay, and a large number of smaller sailing vessels at anchor in the harbour. Air raids on Cyprus were few and limited almost entirely to the first 9 months of 1941. Famagusta, Limassol and Larnaca were all bombed, and at Famagusta one tug was sunk, and we'll hear more about that in a few moments, but little other damage was caused. The biggest danger to ships around Cyprus during the war came from submarines. In April 1942, U-562 laid 12 mines just here at the entrance to Famagusta harbour, later sinking a tug and a sailing vessel. But as I say, submarines were the big risk. On the 17th of August 1942, U-83 torpedoed the troop ship Princess Marguerite en route to Famagusta from Port Said. It was the deadliest single incident involving Cyprus during the war, and its aftermath was captured in this remarkable photograph. The ship caught fire some half an hour after the torpedo struck, rolled over and later sank, and 49 of the soldiers and crew members on board lost their lives. Another 1,080 were rescued, and one of the ships that was doing the rescue was where this photograph was taken from. Over the course of 1943, however, U-boat visits to Cyprus became less and less frequent. By 1944, when this photograph of Famagusta harbour was taken, the war was virtually over in the eastern Mediterranean. Italy had surrendered in September 1943, and the whole of North Africa was by then under Allied control. The German garrison in Greece, meanwhile, was running short of supplies and no longer able to menace anybody. And as this photograph suggests, it really had returned to a fairly sleepy sort of place. And I love, incidentally, the old railway tracks and wagons that you can see there serving the harbour. If Famagusta was quiet in the later parts of the war, one place that was unusually quiet throughout it was Xeros. This is it in the 1930s, when it was a hive of activity. But its main customers had been in Germany, and trading with them was prohibited from 1939 onwards. A few shipments to other customers were arranged in 1940, and a few more again from 1944 onwards. But for most of the war, the mines installations, as you see here, were quiet. The fleet that you see out there in Morphu Bay was sent elsewhere. Cyprus Mines Corporation's tug, Foam, was brought to Famagusta, where she was put into harbour use, and the various lighters were taken all around the island for use by the army. Now, these are interesting little vessels, though they were built during the First World War as primitive landing craft for the Gallipoli campaign, and brought out to the eastern Mediterranean from the shipyards typically in Sunderland and elsewhere on the Tees where they'd been built. And by the 1930s, the CMC had got 7 of them. The army used them for storage of petrol around Cyprus. They could be kept stocked up by the sailing vessels that came around the island. And keeping the petrol stored offshore meant that in the event of an accident, damage would be limited. And that proved to be a wise precaution. On the 31st of August 1942, one of those lighters, full of petrol, exploded at Larnaca, probably ignited by a carelessly discarded cigarette. The lighter itself was burned out, Larnaca Pier was slightly singed, but absolutely no other damage was done. By contrast, the other large mine on the island, the Asbestos mine at Amiandos, was kept busy throughout the war. Asbestos was a priority commodity for the war, much in demand in the manufacture of ships and other machinery, and over 21,000 tonnes of it was exported from the island during the war. As this beautiful artwork poster produced in the United States by the company that was the main customer of the mine at Amiandos shows. The roadway coming down from mountains, Limassol down there on the roofs of the warehouses. I don't think the port of Limassol ever looked like that, even in 1942. The terminus of the roadway that brought the asbestos down from the Troodos anyway wasn't in Limassol, it was in Ziggy, from where a small flotilla of lighters conveyed the product out to the ships. And the importance of the asbestos trade can be seen in the governor's refusal to hand the lighters over to the Navy when the Navy asked for them. In the summer of 1942, after the First Battle of El Alamein, Allied commanders feared that the Germans would sweep across the Mediterranean and take Cyprus as well. And to prevent a landing in Kyrenia, the Navy wanted to take the 4 lighters from Ziggy, tow them round the coast, fill them with concrete and sink them in the harbour to block it. The governor said no. The asbestos trade was more important. The Navy couldn't have them. Very rare that the governor said no to the military during the war, but he did on that count. We'll now look at, little briefly, at some of the more unusual traffic that the war brought to Cyprus. First one, the Russian icebreaker, the Mikoyan. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, this vessel had been stuck in the Black Sea. In November 1941, she sneaked through the Bosphorus and down the Turkish coast past the German blockade of the Aegean, arriving in Famagusta at the start of December. The story is told in this lovely book. If you don't know it and want something to read on the plane going back, I can well recommend it. How many other icebreaker vessels, I wonder, have visited the port of Famagusta? You can see that fabulous ice-breaking bow there. Great big knife-shaped bow that rides up on top of the ice and then crushes through under the weight of the vessel. She then made her way out of the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal, again, how many icebreakers have been through Suez, around the southern tips of Africa and South America before crossing the Pacific to return to the Soviet Union at Vladivostok. Another vessel, a Danube river tug, the Admiral a river tug, hence its shape. It's not a dumpy little harbour tug that you see around ports today. Long, slender, elegant vessel designed for river navigation. She'd been working on the Danube, owned by a British front company, and been spirited out of Romania in 1940. She ended up at Famagusta, where she was the tug sunk in the air raid. And a year later, after sitting on the harbour bottom at Famagusta for several months, she was refloated and taken to the Cyprus Mines Corporation's slipway at Xeros for repair. And while she was there, she was used in an attempt to deceive the Germans about an invasion of Crete. The plan was to try and persuade the Germans that an invasion fleet was being prepared in Cyprus. And this vessel, a tug, but because of her shape, she looks like a regular vessel, she was used as the centrepiece of the display. She was there on the slipway and a series of dummy barges were arranged on the beach next to her. In 1943, she sailed for Egypt and spent the rest of the war working for the Navy at Port Said. Refugees, as well as those one-off arrivals, a steady flow of kayaks arrived from the Aegean during the war, laden with islanders escaping from the Germans. Almost 10,000 refugees arrived in Cyprus over the course of 1942. Most of the boats made landfall at Kyrenia, as you see here, although a fair few also went to Xeros. And fittingly, perhaps, the final set of unusual arrivals in Cyprus were the Italian naval vessels that sailed into Famagusta on the 14th of September 1943 after the armistice. The scene was remembered in this lovely painting by the renowned artist from Famagusta, Paul Giorgiou. It's sometimes described as the Italian battle fleet sailing into Famagusta to surrender. That's pushing it a bit. It was actually 2 minesweepers, 2 tugs, 3 schooners and a trawler. But nonetheless, it's a good image. Once they'd been given new British crews, these vessels were taken out of Famagusta to join the main pool of vessels that the Ministry of War Transport was operating in the Eastern Mediterranean, where they remained in service for the rest of the war. And that sort of ends what I've got to say about the war. But let's just think for a minute, what's left of it? What traces remain today? The answer, almost nothing. Most of the vessels that we saw earlier in the presentation were scrapped in the 1950s or 60s if they survived the war. But curiously, one remains. And that's the HMS Cricket. How many of you have heard of the HMS Cricket? Excellent. Absolutely. Built in 1915, she was sent to the Mediterranean at the start of the Second World War, which was badly damaged by German bombs in North Africa in 1941. Taken to Alexandria for repair, but had instead cannibalised for parts for repairing other vessels, and due to be scrapped. Instead of being scrapped, however, she was towed to Cyprus in July 1944 and anchored off Cape Pila, where she was to be used as a floating target for the RAF, for the training of pilots at the new training school in Nicosia, whose main role was training in Beaufighter aircraft in coastal reconnaissance and bombardment of ships. And that's what she was used for. She sank later in the summer of 1944, unsurprisingly, and she now lies on the seabed, a popular dive site. A little bit further out than the Zenobia, but nonetheless still popular. A bit more of a professional operation to get down to that. Nothing really to do with navigation in Cyprus during the war, but a lovely connection to that time and a popular wartime wreck. Thank you very much.